grew up in a small town in western Illinois, and I had met gay people before, but they weren't known to me then as being gay. They were just people who were in theater and wore leopard print underwear and were bedazzled and glamorous and terrifying to me because they were so comfortable in their own skin, I guess, but also just so much. And I grew up in a fairly religious family, and I made religion a huge part of my life. I don't think that being closeted and being religious are necessarily the same thing. I think there are plenty of people who are religious that don't have problems with their sexuality, but in my world, that was definitely the case. I think that religion and my sexuality were hugely at odds with each other. My mother died when I was fairly young, and so religion became critically important to me because I believed that in order to see her again, that I'd have to be a good Christian. And as I grew up and realized that I didn't have many options for avoiding my sexuality altogether, then I did have a bit of an internal crisis around what I believed to be true. Truth was a big struggle for me, and what that means, and looking at religion and whether or not that was true at the end of the day was my kind of stepping stone for coming out. I left religion well before I was actually able to finally come out of the closet. It's important that people come out because it's relevant to the community, and it matters that people aren't ashamed of themselves and who they are. But I think at its core, the most important part, to me at least, is that that honesty with yourself. The first person that I came out to was, her name was Carol. She was a classmate of mine in college, and I didn't actually intentionally come out to her. She just came into my dorm room, and there was gay porn on my computer. So it wasn't, that was the beginning of the process. I think the first person I intentionally came out to was my closest friend, Stefan, who terrified me when we first met because he was so openly gay, and I was coming from a world where that was not at all the norm. I think like any coming out story, there are goods and bads. When I came out to my family, my brother, who has become my closest friend, was incredible, and I was terrified. I was terrified of telling him because he was just incredibly straight, not in a way that, I mean, he was out of touch with his feminine side by any means, but he was very sexually aware of himself, and was very confident. And when I came out to him, he was very, he was just incredibly loving and kind and thrilled for me and emotional for me, and like felt through all the things that I wanted to feel for myself just for me. So I got to see them on him as someone who I know as being fairly unemotional typically. But when I told him, I think his first response was incredibly inappropriate, but he said, "We need to get you laid." And he'd never said anything like that to me before. We didn't have that kind of brotherly relationship, but then we kind of switched gears once I came out to him. I have 4 older siblings, and each of them took it very differently, mostly in silence, just kind of removing themselves from me as they processed. And my parents took it pretty poorly. I think they know that they did now, but then they kind of lost it. They didn't believe anything that I said to be true. My stepmother was convinced that I had AIDS, and my dad threatened to sue the school that I was going to, because they were both convinced that I had been persuaded into homosexuality by a professor. None of it made a lot of sense at the time, but I think in retrospect they were just having a lot of emotions and not knowing where to put them, and were trying to find their own way to logic. So it was mostly challenging with my family, but I, in retrospect, am really grateful that it was, because it forced me to look at how I communicate with my family and deal with the fact that we didn't have very healthy communication systems, and choose to continue trying to learn from each other and push my parents, which changes the dynamics of that relationship, because now they're great. I would say that it was probably, after I came out, 5 to 7 years are really challenging. And then I had a boyfriend for a long time, and it was about 6 years, and they, I think, realized that they had to face it. I think they spent the first 5 to 7 years not having to address it. It wasn't part of their daily lives. If I didn't mention it, it wasn't a problem. They didn't have to address it, and then suddenly there was a physical representation of my sexuality in the room, and they had no choice. And I think that was good. I think it terrified them, but at the end of the day, it was very powerful. I think I don't know, for me it was a big moment. I think for my dad it probably was a big moment when all of a sudden my grandpa was asking where Michael was. And we kept it a secret from my grandpa, but he kind of made it known to us that he knew and accepted and embraced that, and he got there faster, I think, than my dad did, which is great. When I was coming out of the closet, I went to a professor in college, and I talked to him about the struggles that I was having with my family, and I got the best advice that I could get, which is he looked at the story and he said, God, this is more complicated than anything I've dealt with, and I don't really know what to tell you except that you've got to keep communicating, and that's on you, and your parents won't necessarily do that for you. This is kind of the first time in your life where you have to hold the responsibility of communication, and it's scary, but it also gives you the ownership to control the situation. If you're controlling the communications, there's not a lot that can beat you, I think. Just keep talking. The right solution, I think, was me. It was between me and my family, and that struggle was ours to face. I think that's a hard part of coming out when you're young, is not having a lot of experience to look back on and say that struggle is often worth it. But that struggle was and is still worth it, because I don't think it ever ends completely. But I don't think any relationship with your family is ever struggle-free. There is no single moment of coming out that there is. That was a big misconception, and a bit of a disappointment for me when I started the coming out process, was that I didn't realize that it would take the rest of my life. That it's a regular decision that you make when you get into a new public space with someone you haven't met before. And certainly there are personality identifiers. People know I'm gay, but when you find yourself in a new place where they don't necessarily, or there isn't a lot of communication, or there's an assumption that all men who get into this cab are straight men, you have to face that decision on a regular basis. But I think over time it gets easier, because you stop worrying about making that decision, because it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if my cab driver thinks that I'm straight or not. It matters if he's a decent human being, but that matters in every situation, I think. My favorite part about being me is the freedom to be as boring as I am. I think I struggled a lot in my 20s as a gay man in Chicago with the inability to identify with a lot of gay culture. I've never been interested very much in very exciting things that are exciting to most other gay men. I mostly just want to be at home and read a book, and I think that also comes with age, just the freedom to be able to do that without feeling like I'm missing out on some part of life, when in reality, no, I'm allowed to be just as boring as I am, and I love how exciting my life is inside of that boring.